Hello, friends from the future, and welcome to our presentation on real-time data accelerating system transformation. Before we dive in, we find it really important to acknowledge the land in which we occupy. So I'm in my hometown of Windsor, Essex, which is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy. So it's part of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. My lovely director, Randolyn, she's joining us from Guelph, Ontario, which is the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. And it's the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. You might recognize our faces. We are part of the data team for CAEH. We help all of the streams you see on the bottom working together to end homelessness. We do it with all things data. So you're in great company if you want to talk about data with us today. So like I said, I am with my delightful director, Randolyn. You are hearing us from the past, you are in the future, but present us is actually in the chat right now. So if you have any questions, we'll be answering them in real time, unless we think that those are the types of questions we want to have more of a discussion on, and we'll save them for the end. So today we're going to talk about the importance of data in our sector, something we're both very passionate about. And then we're going to talk about introduction to data equity, and then we're going to also chat about how to decide what data to collect and how all three of those things connect. And at the end, we will have a Q&A. So by the end of this session, you will learn how to use data to create a more equitable system and to accelerate system transformation to end homelessness. Randolyn.
Okay, thanks, Jessica. I think we can all agree that no community can end homelessness without comprehensive real-time data on the problem. Homelessness is a dynamic, person-specific problem that changes from night to night and from person to person. Yet communities have often been encouraged to benchmark their goals against anonymous snapshot data, which is typically collected at a single point in time. That data has been insufficient to help us at a local level respond quickly to such a constantly shifting problem. By the time the data is collected, analyzed, and visualized, the problem has shifted. Communities really need a rapid feedback loop to help tell them how they're doing and to inform quicker, more adaptive decision-making. To some, this insight might seem plain and simple. Other sectors, like the technology sector, has long ago proved the transformative power of real-time data. But homelessness isn't a digital problem. Despite mounting evidence that real-time data is possible, many people in our sector still remain apprehensive. And part of that conviction is informed by the pathway to how we've traditionally used data in the sector. And I wanted to take a brief look at that with you. We could go to the next slide. Thanks, Jess. So many of you are familiar probably with the name Roseanne Haggerty. She's the president and CEO of Community Solutions in the US and the organization behind our American partners, Built for Zero. She is a smart and gifted leader and the author of this article, Moving from Charity to Justice in Our Work to End Homelessness. And when I find myself drifting away from my why am I doing this work? Why am I committed? This is the article that I often come back to again and again, and I really recommend that all of you take the time to read it. One aspect that I appreciate is really the comprehensive overview of the evolution of homelessness response, and in particular, the role that data has played. We can hop to the next slide, Jess. Thank you. So Roseanne Haggerty talks in her article about these 4 different generations that we've experienced in the evolution of the homelessness response. And I wanted to just briefly share those with you so you can just kind of follow this pathway to how we got to using data in our sector. So at a really high level, responses to contemporary homelessness have moved through these 4 stages since the issue became really visible in the late 1970s. Yet awareness of what is working is really uneven still in our sector today, and adoption of successful practices has been slow. So the first stage that Roseanne talks about is the emergency response. And during this time, we mistook short-term measures as real solutions. And we thought about homelessness as a temporary crisis that required temporary supports. When responding to the immediate needs of those experiencing homelessness consumed our focus, our energy, and our resources. And during this generation, data was really absent. This was about a charity approach to help people with what we mistook as a temporary problem. Now, in the second generation, as homelessness increased, the inadequacy of emergency responses began to spur innovations in housing. So this is when we saw increased investments in permanent supportive housing, the adoption of housing first. Yet investments in emergency responses continued to increase, as did the number of people experiencing homelessness. And so this was a different type of gap than having extensive emergency responses without sufficient attention to solutions. The gap here was between having the solutions and actually spreading them to everyone who needed them. In the third generation, Hegarty talks about the focus on time-bound coordinated campaigns. This is when we saw movements like 100,000 homes in the US or 20,000 homes in Canada, or the Rough Sleepers Initiative in the UK. We started collecting more data on the problem. Point-in-time counts began to be mandated during this time, giving us more insights at a local level. And yet another gap was exposed during this time. And this one is between a community's capacity to end homelessness once and the local skills, tools, and systems that were needed to end it for good. And then finally, we have the fourth generation. And this is the realization of the necessity of well-organized teams in each community that shared a clear goal of accurate information and measures to show the effect of different interventions, of training local teams in problem-solving skills like design thinking to understand where the pitfalls and barriers are for avoiding or escaping homelessness, and the possible solutions of quality improvement to test and refine ideas and to use data to see what's working for whom and to help us get better at our work. We could go to the next slide, Jess. Thank you. So this is over those generations, Roseanne and others have identified these 5 shifts that are required to end homelessness. And the one that we want to zone in today is about information, about how as we as a sector need to shift from generalized estimated data on homelessness to collecting and using real-time data.
Thanks, Randolyn. I'm gonna hop back over here and we'll chat about the benefits of real-time data. So if we're talking about the benefits, we should really talk about what exactly we mean by real-time data and why we use it. So when we say real-time data, we're really talking about understanding who needs our support in our system. So who's coming into our system, that'd be the inflow, who's leaving our system, that's the outflow, and who remains, people who are actively homeless. One example I really like thinking about is you wouldn't check the weather once a year to decide how you're going to dress to go outside, just like you shouldn't be checking your homelessness data once a year to see what your community needs to help people become housed. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about real-time system level data. Again, a nice shout out to our friends from Community Solutions. Here's an analogy that I love about, why do we need real-time data? They use this example of throwing a bird versus throwing a baseball. If you throw a baseball, you know exactly where it can land through things like physics. I mean, I'm not a physicist, but it's through physics, like, from force, the way the wind's blowing, like the direction of a glove, your hand, all that fun stuff. But real-time data and complex problem solving, it's like throwing a bird. A bird is alive. You can never predict where it's going to go, how fast it's going to go, or anything like that, right? Like it's a living creature. So that's why we need to keep looking at our data in real time and keep pivoting based on what our data is telling us. What might work right now in our system might not work the next month, the next season. So we have to be really dynamic and we need to make sure that we're willing to pivot so that we can help people get housed in the most efficient way possible. This is where the power of real-time data comes in. You can look at the the power of real-time data in 3 categories. Smarter triage. So we know that resources are limited. How do we make sure that we're using what we do have in the most efficient and effective way? And how can we also stretch the resources we do have to make sure they're being connected properly with people? There's improved systems, which is my jam, love improvement science. It's using that aggregate data to be able to see bottlenecks, trends, identify any areas of improvement, as well as areas of what is working well and how do we capitalize on it. You can then test new strategies, visualize that data, see if it's working well, all with real-time data. And lastly, resource advocacy. This is one that I really love and would love for people to think about in the future. When you have real-time data, you're able to see what do you need, what do people in your community need, what do you have, and then with that gap, you're able to then use it as information to show funders of what you need in your community to help people get housed. So when we think about real-time data, we're talking about quality real-time data. So we mean, when we say quality, we mean a quality by name list. So we want there to be ample provider participation, really great coverage. We want to make sure outreach is top-notch. And when we talk about the quality piece, it's really about if your data balances for month to month, or if it's within this 15% margin of error threshold. We look for that to make sure that people are being accounted for in our system so that we know that when we're looking at our data, it is reliable and we can then make decisions based on it. So there are two levels of this. There's the coordinated access level, which is person specific, and then there's a system level, which is for improvement measures. So we're going to go through each of those with some examples of how you can use them. So the first is that person-specific level. So this is anything to do with an individual. So you're able to deduplicate your data so that you're only counting each person once. You're able to then understand exactly who is in your system and how to best support them. You're then able to house people as quickly as possible based on your local priorities. So whatever is needed most in your community. And then you can quantify exactly what housing resources you need because you understand who is on your list and their needs. So that's person level data. We've all seen this reaching home diagram for the nesting of the functions of a by name list. We can never know who we don't know, right? Like we'll never fully know the universe of people experiencing homelessness in our community, but by going on that journey with real-time data, we're able to see people from this aggregate level, then have a by name list level and keep going so that we can help someone through that continuum in our system to be able to be prioritized for housing and help get them housing as quickly as possible. We can also use that coordinated access data for action-oriented case conferencing. So instead of just wondering what's going on or what's working, you're able to really get down and ask some questions on a personal level, right? Like what would it take to get this person housed? What is the obstacle in our system that is, preventing them from being housed as quickly as possible? How do we overcome this? Who in our community needs to be supporting them? So it's really about helping that person, which again, you're able to do with real-time data. This one is my jam. So it's reliable system level data. It's understanding where you are relative to your goal. So able to make predictions, able to decide, how you need to pivot. You're advocating for resources, making projections. You're able to know what is and isn't working in your community, capitalize on what's working well, and pivot and leave behind what's not. And then you can get to things like functional zero and stay there. So we want to end homelessness, and that's how we're going to do it. Randall knows, and some of you may know, this is my ultimate favorite graph. I love it because it's really helpful to see where things are working or where you might want to focus on improvements in your community. So let me walk through what this graph is for you. It's visualizing inflow and outflow data. Over here on the x-axis, we have the months. So we're going to look at it over time. Each month has both the outflow, like an outflow stacked bar graph, and then the inflow stacked bar graph, and you're able to see the breakdown of each of them. So when we look at things like October, for this particular community, we're able to see that in the outflow, most of their outflow is move-ins, which is something that we love. We want to always make sure that we have more move-ins than anything else. We're also then able to look at things like in November, you can see the breakdown of inflow for how much of it is total returns from housing, from return from inactive, aged in, and newly identified. By seeing how much of your inflow is related to these different data points, you're then able to land on different projects to try to get the biggest impact for reducing inflow and increasing outflow. You can then also take system level data to make projections. So if you wanted to say, end chronic homelessness or end homelessness by March 2021, in this case is when this projection looks, you're able to see what you would have to do to get there. What would your actively homeless number look like to get there? How are you making sure that if this is when your goal is, how is everyone working together to make it happen? And last one, it's process mapping. It's not a graph, but it is my favorite tool because you're able to collect timestamps from when someone presents in your system to when they are housed. If you do collect these timestamps with your real-time data, you're able to see where do people spend the most time in your system. And then you can start working on projects to lessen that time so that people can get housed much faster. Randolyn, over to you, friend.
All right, thanks, Jessica. So Jess talked about the power of real-time data and how it can be helpful in transforming our system, identifying gaps, interventions, whether improvements are working or not, all really important stuff. But we also need to recognize that we're talking about individuals. And not only do those individuals have different identities that they carry with them, but also are affected by biases within our system. And so it's been really important for us to lean into data equity and understanding what that means in our work. And so in the past couple of years, we've been following along with the work of Community Solutions in the US and guided by an understanding that homelessness cannot be ended without addressing racial inequality. Community Solutions has been working with its communities to address racism and homelessness and sharing how they're learning and how they're finding solutions. So I really encourage folks to learn more about that work that's happening as part of the National Racial Equity Working Group. So this work in the US and also the uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement and Land Back movement and a commitment of our organizational values of diversity, equity, inclusion, and reconciliation has inspired the data team at CAH to lean into data equity. And so we wanted to take some time today to share some of what we've learned and how it can be applied to real-time data. Full warning, this is pretty new territory for us. And the format of the conference this year doesn't really facilitate an engaging group discussion, but we're all eyes in the chat. We'd love to hear your feedback and share your knowledge and experience. And I'm also always down for a coffee chat post-conference. I'm eager to learn from all of you. So first, I just wanted to share the first definition here of data equity. It's a really simple, straightforward definition that's offered by Heather Krauss, who leads an amazing project for equity and data science called We All Count. And earlier this year, I did a workshop with Heather and it was phenomenal. And we'll share the link to her website at the end of the presentation as well. Another definition I love is from an American consultant by the name of Joyce Lee Ibarra. She says the term data equity captures a complex and multifaceted set of ideas. It refers to the considerations through an equity lens of the ways in which data is collected, analyzed, interpreted, and distributed. It underscores marginalized communities' unequal opportunities to access data. At times, they're harmed from data's misuse. It raises the issue of data sovereignty and the democratization of data. And data equity pushes us to consider the ways that data can reinforce stereotypes and exacerbate problems like racial bias or otherwise undermine social justice. So Joyce talks about three really important points related to data equity. The first is that data is not objective. So while numbers and figures can be neutral in themselves, they don't exist in a vacuum. Data is collected, analyzed, and interpreted and distributed by people who bring their work, their subjective experiences, and their potential biases. The goals or motivations we have in our data work, as well as the questions we ask about how they're framed, are likewise informed by our own perspectives, even unintentionally. So various forms of interpretation bias, for example, can color our understanding of data, leading us to selectively value or dismiss certain outcomes and explanations over others. The other thing Joyce talks about is that data can actually create and perpetuate power dynamics. So knowledge, as the saying goes, is power. Data as a form of knowledge can create power imbalances, which become more visible when we reflect on questions such as, like, why are we seeking to collect the data? Who is empowered to collect the data? Who will be the end user of the data? And who are the experts in the data project? Another thing that Joyce talks about is that equity needs to be addressed throughout the data lifecycle. So the data lifecycle refers to all the different stages of a data project that offer opportunities to practice greater consciousness of and commitment to equity, fairness, and access. So looping back to We All Count, the initiative of Heather Kraus, she has broken down the data lifecycle into 7 stages, right from funding through communicating and distributing the results, and describes the potential inequality pitfalls in each. And so it's, again, I really recommend going and checking out Heather's website and also participating in any of the trainings that she's offering. They have been incredibly helpful in our learning. So one of the things that Heather starts with is talking about motivation. So if we could just skip ahead to the next slide, Jess. Thank you. Okay, so starting with motivation, I wanted to talk about and acknowledge that in the sector of housing and homelessness, a lot of data is collected as part of an impact evaluation, either to demonstrate the need for the program or intervention or to demonstrate its success. And while this work is really critical in order to make the case to receive or maintain funding, this in itself is a power dynamic. So Edgar Villeneuve, who's the author of Decolonizing Wealth, has said that grant making is not trusting of the community, and the community is not trusting of funders. Despite communities who are closest to the problem having a really unique insights into the solutions, funders are still requiring research and data to make decisions. Another incredible resource that I will share with you is this publication called Why Am I Always Being Researched?, which is part of the Chicago Beyond Equity series. And that publication offers guidance on how to shift that power dynamic in the way that community organizations, researchers, and funders uncover knowledge together. It's an equity-based approach to research that offers one way in which we can restore communities as authors and owners. So it's really important to answer the question of why we're collecting, analyzing, and publishing data before it begins. And to do this, we need to be really explicit in our motivation. So data teams spend a lot of time talking about how they'll implement data science, which methods they'll use, which data sets and features are best, what results they need. But we don't often spend a lot of time talking about why they do each of these things. So the why you and your team design and produce a data product largely determines all of the next steps that happen after. So it's very important here to be really explicit in your motivation, and engaging funders in this work can also help them understand the why and may have them questioning their own initial intentions. So the first example that I wanted to provide here is kind of a motivation that we see from a lot of communities. So they're looking to improve the number of move-ins for our most vulnerable neighbors experiencing chronic homelessness. So this is just kind of a common general motivation that people might have for collecting move-in data. So what we want to do is get more explicit about this motivation and really lean into some of these elements and think about the why behind them. So when we say to improve, are we talking about increasing the number of move-ins? Do we have baseline data that will help us understand what move-ins are happening now? What do we see as an improvement? Is it the type of housing, or is it merely just the number that we're looking to bump up? When we talk about move-ins, are we talking about move-ins to permanent housing, to temporary situations? Again, what type of move-in are we counting here? And when we talk about our most vulnerable neighbors, how are we measuring that vulnerability? Are we taking into account systems of oppression that affect different groups of people? Or are we kind of lumping them all together under this umbrella of experiencing homelessness? And finally, when we talk about chronic homelessness, what types of chronic homelessness are we prioritizing for those move-ins? Is it folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness or staying in encampments? Is it those in emergency shelters? Again, just being really explicit about pulling these pieces apart can help guide the project. And so an example of this statement reworded to be more explicit could look like this. So our purpose in collecting move-in data is to measure the current rate of move-ins to permanent housing among all individuals experiencing chronic homelessness over the age of 16, and to understand the differences in move-in rates to permanent housing along the lines of race and gender. So you can see right away, pulling this apart and being more explicit will guide the methods you use, what data you need to collect, how you will analyze and visualize that data. Okay, so again, I have the recommendation here to check out this resource, Why Am I Always Being Researched? And I love this quote, if evidence matters, we must care how it gets made. And so again, I want to talk about the importance of collecting the right type of data to help us answer the question that we identified in our explicit motivation. So if this was the community, we can see that the move-ins are increasing over time, and we might automatically celebrate this and say that the interventions we are implementing are working, our move-in numbers are going up. But we can't disaggregate this data unless we ask the right questions. So in our explicit motivation, we acknowledge that we want to look at race and gender, which would allow us to disaggregate this data and see the differences between different groups. So if you just click through, Jess, we'll see what that data could look like disaggregated between two groups. And you can think of these as two different genders, two different races, two different age categories. But what we see when we disaggregate the data is that, yes, move-ins are moving up for group 2, but for group 1, they're staying relatively the same. And so what this tells us is that the intervention is working for one group of people, but it's not making a difference for the other group. And so you cannot visualize and see this information. You can't disaggregate this data without collecting the right data. On the flip side, we never want to collect data that we don't plan to use, that we don't plan to disaggregate, and that we don't plan to use to inform interventions. All right, and then finally, I could talk about what I have learned around analysis and data equity for probably an entire session, but I thought I would share this one great tool that I learned, which is the equity gap score. And basically what this is that if you have a mandate that includes equity between any category of people, whether it's race, sex, income, education, you need to have an equity gap score. And it's simply the number that helps to contextualize a statistic. It'll help add meaning to any data result and can help you track equity issues in any data project. So the first number tells you the overall information. Second number tells you how the equity between categories of people is doing. So an equity gap ratio of 1 is a perfect equity score, and it gets worse the higher the score is. So in this example, we have 4 different groups and their move-in rate is different for each of those groups. So we want to take the best, which is the 25%, divided by the worst, which is the 4%, and we get an equity gap score of 6.25. So 6.25 means that the move-in rate is 6 times higher for those in group 1 than among group 2. And it shows the equity between the highest and lowest categories. So if we're planning interventions around increasing that move-in rate, among group 2, we want to see the equity score slowly decline as move-ins increase. And so that equity gap score can be a really helpful tool for communicating the difference between different groups of people, but also for measuring progress on improvements that you're introducing in your system. So just a tool that I wanted to be able to share with folks that I think can be very useful in our sector and in the work that we're doing. All right, so we have linked in all of the resources that we chatted about today. The amazing website by Heather Krause and all of her trainings are linked in there as well. I recommend anyone that does research among vulnerable populations to read this publication, Why Am I Always Being Researched? It is phenomenal. Data equity and why it matters, that is the article by the consultant that I noted early. And then Roseanne Haggerty, my go-to for when I need to reaffirm my why, is this article, Moving from Charity to Justice in Our Work to End Homelessness. And we've also linked in our CAH data reliability tool, which can help you understand the different real-time data points that we use in finding lists and how you can work toward achieving that in your community. So that is all for us today. We appreciate so much your attention and engagement today. As I mentioned, I am always up for a coffee chat, and I'm sure Jess is too. So please reach out to me after if we don't get a chance to answer your questions today, or you just want a thought partner in some of the work that you're doing. I would love to talk with you. So I think that wraps it for us. We are going to be able to answer some Q&A live, which is very exciting. So thanks to all of you, and we'll see you in 2 seconds.